Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Welcome to week three of Global Politics, where this week we're going to be talking about post-colonialism and the post-colonial roots of international relations as we know it. Uh, Before I go on, let me sort of say, let me just, okay, there you go. Let me say that if you have any questions about the syllabus, about the readings, etc., either sort of send me an email and make an appointment for my office hours, or bring those questions up during discussion groups. It's up to you, but if you don't feel comfortable sort of talking or asking those kinds of questions in the discussion group format, I would recommend that you make an appointment and talk to me. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about what it means to uh, ontologically, epistemologically understand the world as the way that it is. And I've sort of structured this lecture around four themes of seeing the world, knowing the world, learning and unlearning the world, and decolonizing international relations, or it could also just be called decolonizing the world. So this will all make sense in a way, but what I'm trying to sort of, the reason why the word world is in quotation marks is because uh, as we will learn, there's a particular kind of world that has become universalized through European colonialism. So we're going to sort of problematize that concept, and we're going to sort of think that concept critically. So let's start by what we understand by the word seeing the world, what it means to sort of see the world. When I sort of ask you, if we were in a classroom to sort of say, what does the world map look like? Probably you would have gone with this world map, which is a sort of the famous Mercator projection. The reason why this is famous is because it actually sort of, I mean, every map distorts the world, right? Like to sort of put a spherical object into a flat surface requires distortion. But this is a particular kind of distortion where the world is, in a way, made to sort of have Europe in the middle, and the northern hemisphere is disproportionately larger than southern hemisphere. So that becomes particularly known among the critiques of this particular projection in relation to the size of Greenland versus the size of Africa. And you might sort of say, what's the significance of that? And that's what I'm trying to get at in this lecture, where we're going to sort of see, building on last week's ideas of discourse and sort of centrality of discourse to international politics, we're going to try to understand what it means to place Europe at the center of the world. And furthermore, interesting thing about this map is that it's a sort of an understanding of the world as it's seen through nations, and how sort of the world is a sort of collection of nations. But there's very different ways of seeing the world. We can understand what the world is, how it works, by looking at different kinds of map projections. Again, here we can sort of see perhaps the sort of, this is supposed to move, but I guess it's not moving right now. Where we will see, in this map, we would have seen how the internet usage sort of lights up between day and night across the world. One of the things that becomes clear when you look at this map is sort of different connectivities of different parts of the world, where we sort of see like parts of China not being connected, most of African continent not being connected, parts of Latin America not connected, north, the Canadian north, the sort of the Russian north not being connected. So when we speak of a connected world, what we're actually talking about is particular connections between particular parts of the world. Some parts are significantly more connected to the world than others. Another way of thinking about that would be to sort of look at the global flight map and see what parts of the world get the most connection. So when we speak of a globalized world, we're not necessarily speaking of a globalized world. We're speaking of globally connected world where sort of different parts, particular parts, become significantly more connected than others. Or when we speak of trade, when we look at trade volumes around the world, you see sort of a particular sort of hub, a particular movement of trade between North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, bypassing other parts of the world almost fully. And again, sort of like a more accurate representation of the world would look like this, which would put sort of, Greenland to be significantly smaller, Africa significantly larger, Europe in the bottom corner. Yet sort of like we're not accustomed to this. And we're not accustomed to this precisely because that original map, the Mercator projection, was done in a way to facilitate European ships to sort of come and go from Europe much more easily than they would have otherwise. It was sort of a navigational map to sort of help or facilitate uh, European colonialism, European sort of mercantilism, European trade, and European exploitation of the rest of the world. So maps are symbolic. They're not necessarily like, this is not the reason why the world is the way that it is, but it's actually a projection of the world as it is. So if we're sort of thinking about imagination as a limit of world politics, then we probably think of this as a particular kind of imagination. So then there's three questions that I want to ask about the world as we know it in this lecture. So when we speak of international politics or the world, who is seen in this world? Who are the actors? Who are seen as legitimate actors? Furthermore, what facts or who are known? What do we consider to be legitimate facts, legitimate sources of information? And then finally, who are heard, right? Like who are the sort of going into the sort of the same thing as who is seen, but not just seen, but rather heard, right? Like who are the sort of the vocal international players? So to put into perspective, we do have an understanding of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, right? Like we sort of understand that there are. I mean, I wouldn't go as far to say they're not contacted because they're aware of the world outside. They're just not contacted in the way that they have not been assimilated. They have been, in a way, left alone, or sort of there's a struggle to leave them alone in international politics. But when we think of international politics, we don't think of them. We think of, in a way, this, right? So, like, if we're thinking of global connectivity, globalization, the world is not structured around these kinds of voices, but rather these kinds of connectivity. Or when we think of contemporary international politics, we think of a dynamic that we're going to talk about in this class in the next lecture in relation to citizens versus non-citizens. So citizen-human dynamic, in that we can speak of human rights, but essentially what we have is a world system built around citizenship rights. And in that context, for example, is the world politics that we talk of considers migrants who are trying to cross the ocean, like the Mediterranean Sea, the same kind of actors as people like you and I who have the privilege of having a citizenship, and particularly sort of privileged citizenship. So in that understanding, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of destabilize your understandings of the world by perhaps problematizing what's called the Eurocentric roots of the contemporary world order. So that requires you to rethink or question what it means to know the world, right? When I sort of say, what do you know about the world? You might sort of come up with different facts, mostly sort of historical, and perhaps present a particular kind of history. Now, this class has a number of students who are not necessarily sort of the product of Canadian education system. So they might have different kinds of histories that they have learned, right? So if you learn history in Turkey, you might learn about Turkish history. If you learn history in Canada, you might learn about Canadian history. If you learn history in Colombia, you might learn about Colombian history. Now, again, you would learn a version of those histories. You would probably learn particular national histories or nationalistic or national constructed understandings of histories. In the same way that historically, when you're speaking of Canadian history, most Canadian history books would not have spent too much time talking about Indigenous politics or Indigenous histories, in the same way that most Turkish histories don't speak of Kurdish history. I assume, ignorantly, perhaps the sort of the Colombian histories would not necessarily speak of the same kinds of indigenous histories of the peoples sort of prior to the Spanish colonization. What I'm trying to do right now is to sort of create a particular history of now, meaning that to understand now as not sort of a time period that is outside of history, but rather sort of the pinnacle of the history as we know it. So it's a particular kind of understanding, particular kind of statement about what it means to have a history of now. So that's a genealogical approach. But what I'm trying to do that by doing that, I'm trying to sort of perhaps problematize or destabilize the contemporary moment to understand what it means to have histories or history of now. So let's start with our civilization's preferred form of living, which is that at some point we have come to the conclusion that settling down was better than nomadic living. So we prioritize in our histories and our understandings of the world cities over nomadic tribes. And that's precisely why when we think of the roots of the modern state order, we think of Athens rather than we think of the Asian steppe and the Mongolic or the Mongolian hordes. And that's sort of the root of what I'm trying to get at is that sort of histories of now make particular kinds of preferences. In the same way that we privilege the settlers over the nomads, we also make a preference between we prefer the colonizer over the colonized. So when we think of histories, when we think of Pizarro seizing the sort of Inca of Peru, we don't think of sort of like the conditions of possibility of that moment and thinking about sort of the particular kind of a period in Incan history for Pizarro to arrive. Instead, we sort of say Pizarro arrived and the Incas did not understand sort of the men in armor, so they assumed that they were sort of gods. Instead, sort of Pizarro has done something that for the Incan history, Incan politics was unimaginable. In the battle, he kidnapped the king or the sort of the emperor of the Incas, and as a result, sort of destabilized the Incan Empire. In the same way that the British have when they were colonizing India, it's not like sort of British by force have colonized India. They have decided that certain Rajas were going to be the sort of the actors through which they were going to govern India. So colonialism doesn't have a linear history, but when we think of colonialism, we don't necessarily look at those moments of trade-offs and complicated histories. We look at sort of the outcome. So in a way, we privilege the sort of the histories of the colonizer rather than the histories of the colonized. When we think of what has happened, we don't necessarily read histories in a sort of a what someone like Edward Said would call a contrapuntal or a two-way reading. We read it as a sort of a unidirectional history. And that's partially because we sort of tend to write histories from the perspectives of winners rather than sort of those that are those that have lost sort of the quote unquote those historical moments. So when we think of the history of Cold War, we don't think of the sort of histories of the Soviet Union. We think of the victorious moment of the sort of the American order and American sort of empire. But in many ways, this is all to say, for this understanding, for this problematization of international politics, we have to understand that what happened before us matters, so that we cannot think of the contemporary condition of the United States outside of the questions of slavery, or we cannot think of the sort of quote unquote underdevelopment of Africa or South America or Central America outside of the imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, so that we cannot write histories of the present moment without thinking about the 10 to 15 million people who were enslaved in the so-called slave coast of Africa and were brought to the quote-unquote New World. And we cannot think of the wealth and the riches that sort of Europe and European empires have extracted from places like Europe and South America. So if you think of that North American or the North Atlantic trade of sort of the trade winds, we can think of how the human resources, quote unquote, like human resources, so the slaves were sort of extracted from Africa, brought into the New World, then to use them in extraction of other resources, earths, minerals, cotton, tobacco, etc., through which then sort of the wealth was generated and brought back to the New World. So that cyclical, that sort of cycle of exploitation and understanding has to be present in our histories, in our understandings of the present moment in the world and international relations. So we can't think of things like underdevelopment or political instability without sort of thinking about histories of slavery, imperialism, etc. And another part of this history is the sort of the question of representation and how we understand the other, the quote unquote other, to our sort of core identity. So this is the cover. This image is a French Impressionist painting of the supposedly the painting of the Ottoman palace, where it underlines, mysticism, a sort of like a little absurdity, a homoeroticism, and a sort of like irrationality or a modernity of that period. So a literary critique and post-colonial theorist, Edward Said, has used this as a way to make his case for what he calls a theory of Orientalism, where Europe creates its others, its sort of its non-European counterparts through this gaze of acronous, non-modern, backwards, irrational, outside of the contemporary moment. So it's using this in a way, it's using these kinds of images to create a particular understanding of the non-West as sort of not up to the standards of the West. And Edward Said's political argument or analysis is that in return is used to make the case for European intervention in the form, whether it's in the form of colonialism, whether it's in the form of more contemporary wars. That sort of that backwardness, that sort of unusualness, that abnormality of the non-West is used to justify Western intervention in those places. So this is all to say that while we can look at the flowers of the contemporary moment, we have to understand that the roots, the rhizomes of that sort of contemporary moment runs deep into the earth. So to understand the connections, we have to understand the sort of the roots of the historical, the present moment. So in this moment, let me take a pause and ask the question: how do we then come to politically organize ourselves around states? And we talked a little bit about this in the last week when we talked about the idea of Westphalian order. But let's take the Canadian example of sort of where we live. And this is actually sort of an interesting moment, right? We're going to talk a little bit about, or actually quite a bit about this next week when we're talking about sovereignty. But let's think about sort of what it means to have local lives right now during COVID, and what it means to sort of perhaps how different it is to teach these particular 4 slides now versus a year ago, right? A year ago, when I asked what is sort of like, why would you identify yourselves as Canadian and not Nova Scotian? A lot of people sort of have said, well, we're a unified body. We're sort of like, we get the benefits from sharing the sort of Canada as a whole, the resources of the West versus resources of the East when we come together, whatever. But now that sort of we're talking about the Atlantic bubble and sort of the virus and sort of how we in this part of the country seem to be faring better than other parts of the country, it's not unreasonable to ask, well, what is it about Canadian identity that we see ourselves to be a part of? So why is it that we don't think of, just the Valley as an entity? Why do we then scale up to Nova Scotia? And when we're thinking of Nova Scotia or the Atlantic bubble, what do we sort of ignore? What do we not look at? What side of histories do we have to ignore, right? So we call it the Atlantic bubble, but it could also just be called the Mi'kma'ki, right? Like with the exception, or with the sort of like exception of Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI have sort of all come into the sort of the land of Mi'kmaq, or the Mi'kma'ki. But if you scale it up again, then you'll come to Canada as a construct, that with its sort of territories and provinces, etc. But again, that abstraction of Canada, again, ignores particular different kinds of abstraction. So creation of territory, creation of identity often is not just learning, but it's also forgetting, right? So there's a great deal of forgetting that needs to happen to sort of create these stable constructs of a global order, because Canada is not exceptional in that. Every country erases certain histories to create a particular kind of historical narrative. And that takes us to the colonial moment of unlearning, right? Colonial moment is not just a history of learning, a history of teaching. It's also a history of erasure of identity, erasure of history, erasure of language. to create this sort of seemingly harmonious sort of moment in history where the Europeans came and sort of quote unquote civilized who was here. And in Canada, we understand the histories of residential schools, etc., as those practices, as those moments. So colonialism, to give a very sort of brief definition, is the practice of extending or retaining of authority by a country over other people or territories, generally historically with the aim of economic dominance. And historically, this is a European practice, although it does not mean that imperialism or colonialism is an exclusively European practice in the sense that other entities have done it too. But the European order, the European sort of colonialism has taken it to its pinnacle. In that, what someone named Chakrabarty refers to as a provincialization of Europe has occurred, meaning that importing of European forms of government, bureaucracy, and European understandings of modernity have been exported to different parts of the world, where we now understand the world not through different tribal identities or different villages, but through the sort of the construct of the state. And colonialism its impacts range from, resource extraction to cultural genocide and anything in between. So in some places, colonialism was almost exclusively about the resource extraction. Now, Europeans had very twisted understandings of what resources were. So slavery was in many ways seen as a resource extraction. So in some ways, that resource extraction is very much tied into our understanding of cultural genocide. In other ways, we can't think of, moments like the residential schools or, the great expansion to the West in North America, or sort of what has happened in Australia, etc., outside of our, set of a terminology of cultural or just proper genocide. So we have to understand that colonialism in many ways was a destructive power. It was almost exclusively a destructive power. It's even its productive moments were destructive in that it had to destroy existing cultures and existing civilizations to create something new. Colonialism, so this is sort of how the world was divided among different kinds of imperial powers. So this, again, is the European colonialism as it stood in 1945. Like it ignores things like sort of, Spanish colonization of South America and Central America, and Portuguese colonization of Brazil, etc. So we have to understand this is just a snapshot of it, or snapshot of it, not Snapchat of it, as things stood in 1945 at the beginning of the decolonization period. So even though the world has gone through a process of decolonization, meaning that there has been an undoing of colonialism and the procedural returning of territories and government to colonized populations, and this has sort of started with World War I, with the fall of the empires in sort of the Middle East, but then also really gained momentum following the Second World War. It does not mean that we live in a decolonial world. It means that we have now moved into what is called a post-colonial world, where sort of we look at, we live in a period where there has been a certain amount of decolonization of practices, processes, and thought, but that we have not sort of reached a state where impact of colonialism have been completely removed. So we don't live in a decolonial or anti-colonial world. We live in a post-colonial world where this is not necessarily a spatiotemporal moment or a spatiotemporal concept. Rather, post-colonialism is a process of decolonization of the mind, decolonization of practices, processes, reacquisition of language, reclaimings of history, etc. And we see this in places like Nova Scotia very clearly, where there is what's called settler colonialism. And we see these moments, these attempts to create indigenous understandings come to front. So in Acadia, we talk of acknowledging the land, or we talk of, the sacred teachings. We talk of Mi'kmaq. We talk of paying respect to the sort of the truth and reconciliation process that Canada is supposedly going through. Those are important parts of post-colonialism. But again, it is both theoretically and practically rather difficult to sort of claim, I would actually go as far as say impossible to claim that we live in a decolonial world, in the sense that we have not decolonized. Decolonization is maybe the formal aspects of decolonization has occurred in the world, but certainly not in places where we have settler colonialism. And that's important to understand because in Canada, we live in a sort of what's called a settler colony where colonialism process has replaced indigenous populations or sort of have pushed them into the fringes of society through a cultural genocide, but also through sort of the creation of spaces like reserves and in Canada through sort of the Indian Act, etc., where we have sort of in a way replaced the properties and the sort of the rights of indigenous populations with the properties and rights of settler colonials or settlers. And, you know, again, in Nova Scotia very recently, we have seen the effects of that with the lobster fishing and the sort of the tensions that stemmed from Indigenous right to fish under the peace and friendship treaties versus settler fishermen's claims to sort of like federal law. And that use there you see the tension, and we can talk about that later, but it's not necessarily about like what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is to understand the roots, the colonial roots of the international order, and the amount of erasure or sort of forgetting that needs to happen for us to come to the point where we can make the case that we live in a post-colonial or sort of decolonial, depending on the perspective, moment. So international relations then becomes a colonial artifact, a colonial sort of legacy, right? Because there's our understandings of nations, our understandings of states, etc., is, from this perspective, an outcome of the provincialization of Europe, or the proliferation of European forms of governance, government, diplomacy, statehood, not only as sort of commonplace entities, but also in reference to what we were talking about last class as global norms. And through sort of colonialism, what we have is the normalization of the Westphalian order and the orders, borders, identities nexus. So history of the present, as seen from mainstream theories of international politics, ignores histories of violent colonialism and exploitation, or erases them, or sort of pushes them aside in through sort of concepts like rational choice and different kinds of behavioral theories of state. So what we need to do as a reaction to this, as sort of seen from post-colonial international relations, is that we need to what's called decolonize international relations. We need to bring plurality of voices and concerns from different parts of the world. We need to understand different epistemologies and different ontologies, different norms and different savoir-faire or know-how into our understandings of international politics. So we need to sort of stop just focusing on rational behavior, etc. We need to start focusing on perhaps different perspectives and different voices and different understandings of the world and how it functions. And in that same way, we also need to think about what's called worlding IR. And one of your readings this week is looking at this understanding of what it means to world international relations. And they define worlding as the coexistence of multiple and intersecting economic, political, social, historical, and knowledge practices that they are geoculturally situated. So because the assumption that I have been playing with is that international relations, both the discipline, but also the sort of the set of practices, so the uppercase and lowercase international relations, are built on Eurocentric ideas and concepts, we need to sort of bring in different kinds of political, social, historical knowledge practices from different parts of the world that have different geocultural origins. So that there are many worlds and many interpretations of what international relations is and what it can't be. But in the current formulation, many perspectives are sidelined or ignored. And that's sort of like often either pushed into a literature of development and literature of inequality and colonialism. But what worlding IR and decolonizing IR approaches are trying to do is to bring forward those agendas into sort of the mainstream international relations and trying to rewrite histories of the world from this different perspectives. So many of the origins of contemporary global inequality rest with colonialism and its externalities. And I use the externality in quotation because I would be terrified to sort of understand concepts like slavery or the resource extraction and the sort of pillaging of the sort of the non-Western parts of the world to be seen in economic terms of externality, that these are horrendous violences. But the so-called underdevelopment of the global South is due to the theft of resources, both human and non-human alike, and their futures by the global North. So when we go into global North capitals like Paris or London or Berlin, when you visit museums, when you visit sort of squares, you see the wealth, you see the resources that have been plundered from the global South to make the global North, the metropolises in the global North, much more wealthier, much more sort of established and lawfully. So we have to understand that those histories cannot be seen without histories of colonialism, histories of slavery, histories of theft, histories of violence. So those are intertwined. So you can't visit the British Museum without thinking about the theft. You can't visit the Louvre without thinking about the theft. You can't visit, the Smithsonian without thinking about slavery. That those are intertwined. Those are they should be written into the fabric of those institutions. You can't visit New York or Washington, D.C. without thinking about slavery. You can't visit London without thinking about slavery. You can't visit Madrid without thinking about slavery. Those are histories of Europe that Europe always writes off or ignores or sort of says it's a thing of the past. But this understanding of international politics argues that they're not things of the past. And even if they are things of the past, that past is very much at play in the present. So let's take a moment and go back to our original puzzle of how COVID-19 and this post-colonial approach can sort of come to play together. And let's ask ourselves, how does COVID-19 impact everyone? Does it impact everyone equally? So this is not just sort of an age group or sort of, what's called premorbidities or whatever. But what I'm talking about is globally, does COVID-19 impact everyone equally? And furthermore, how does COVID-19 impact different groups inside the nation? So one of the things that we're seeing in the United States is that Black Americans die more of COVID-19 than white Americans. And in many ways, we're seeing that because there is a sort of socioeconomic inequality at play here. So that the sort of wealthier are healthier. And the poor are sort of more prone to things like obesity and different kinds like high blood pressure, etc., that make COVID-19 more deadly. And that they have, the wealthy have much better hospital or medical access versus sort of the poor. And in some ways, the same thing happens with indigenous communities in the United States. And I'm giving the United States as an example, but that truth applies to Canada or anywhere else. Or sort of we look at the way in which the disease spreads much slower in places like Africa, but once it starts spreading, once it sort of made its foot in those places in the continent of Africa and sort of the poorest states in Africa, then the care that the people living in those states can get is significantly lesser quality than the sort of the care that they can get here. And that sort of plays into this sort of this post-colonial route. So this comes down to the sort of the colonial legacies and present realities, that the sort of this blurs that sort of present moment and the colonial moment and in a way brings it together. So COVID-19 allow us to sort of problematize the colonial origins, or it also allows us to sort of problematize the inside-outside distinction and sort of seeing that how the historical inequalities that we might sort of say, oh, it's a historical thing that is outside of this moment, that is outside of this country, and bring it in to sort of say, well, actually, those dynamics still at play here, right? Even though we're not sort of like an imperial country as we were in Canada anymore, we still have sort of colonial and imperial problems that we're dealing with. So to understand then this sort of problem, we can ask ourselves, what do we need to unlearn or learn to see different perspectives in both politics, but also in international politics? What remains seen, heard, privileged in discourses of global politics? And how do these discourses impact global power configurations? So, in conclusion, as take-home points, we need to be reflexive about what we think we know, and that we need to sort of think and rethink what it is that we know about the world. That, like, sort of a part of university education is actually a great part of university education is about unlearning things that you think you know and learning sort of different perspectives on those things. And that in international politics, that there are many worlds that exist simultaneously, but also just one physical world, so that there's different interpretations of that reality that happen simultaneously within the same space. And the colonial origins of modern world play a central role in shaping our global inequalities presently today. And the discipline of international relations is highly Eurocentric and reflects on a Eurocentric configuration of norms that we will talk about next week when we're discussing concepts of sovereignty, anarchy, borders, citizenship, etc. So I hope that this was clear. So I will also upload this week a slide on your briefing papers to sort of get you start thinking about that. So that it's not just a slide, it's a slide deck. But there'll be another presentation uploaded this week. So have a great week, stay healthy, and happy Thanksgiving in advance. Take care.